Hello, and welcome to Time as Distance from Experience, Chapter 5 of Economics, Time, Mind, and Spirit. In the early 20th century, physics understood time as an independent variable that seemed to just flow without change. Because of inconsistencies in data and contradictions in models, a new paradigm was needed. This was referred to as space-time and was part of the development of Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. Time was not something that ticked away. It was one way to measure the distance between two events. We often use the term a length of time. Time becomes a series of moments we consider a path. Optimization occurs over the whole path, not just a single moment. So stability and sustainability depend on how long a path can be maintained. Now, in the 20th century, there was developed the turnpike theory, which is used in economics with respect to how to grow economies, accumulate capital, or maximize lifetime utility. The idea is that if the distance is great, one may accelerate the process by getting on a high-speed highway, a turnpike, even if the turnpike seems a little out of the way. On the other hand, if the distance is short, getting on the turnpike may increase the time to travel. Let's consider education and labor turnpike. One example is the accumulation of human capital through education. If one expects to live long enough, it becomes worthwhile to invest a lot in education while young, work full-time for many years at an increased salary, and enjoy retirement as human capital depletes. The duration of working full-time would be considered the turnpike. So if one expects a short lifespan, then depending on the starting point, it may be optimal not to get an education. Since this is very dependent on time horizon, life expectancy and the uncertainty of one's current condition will weigh heavily on the optimality of human capital accumulation. In other words, if you think you're only going to live to 20, you might not want to go to college. One type of path is through a decision tree. This is a series of moments which are dependent on the choices made in previous moments. So, past events become the causes of future events. This is how we usually consider causality. In econometrics, an extension of this is Granger-Simms causality, often used to differentiate correlation and causation. Now, we're going to step back from that assumption and consider time as it relates to three modes of causality. One is push causality. That is when past events pushing the present away from it. Pull causality, future events pulling the present toward it. And pop causality, where present events popping into or out of existence. So let's consider push causality. So pushing has the characteristic of momentum and inertia without a particular focus on outcome. Right? So the analogy is pushing a heavy rock. Since one is pushing it away, there are many directions it can go toward. When movement occurs, there can be much uncertainty about what will happen. So the momentum from past event tends to move events along, but not necessarily in directions we prefer. How about pull causality? Here, pulling has the characteristic of attraction and purposefulness, with events drawn toward a particular outcome. So the analogy is pulling a heavy rock. Since one is pulling it towards oneself, there are few directions it can move toward. When movement occurs, there is less uncertainty about what will happen. The attraction toward future events can also be experienced as destiny. And finally, pop causality. So this is popping in and out, has the characteristic of randomness and novelty. So behavior and experiences may have meaning within the moment, but without seeming to have been pushed along by the past nor pulled toward a future. Econometric models might include this as an error term. So, the relationship between causality and reality? Well, push causality, driven by memories and sentiment. Pull causality, driven by imagination and planning. And pop causality, driven by novelty and the unexpected. So let's consider distance to experience now. We can think about time as a distance from an experience. The present is that which one experiences immediately. It is the moment now. It is as if the distance is zero. The past and the future are mediated experiences. We do not experience them as now, and only through the lens of memory or imagination. We connect to them through some path between now and then. So, similar to the theory of relativity, people have different perceptions of how far away an experience is. So, if we were to graphically represent mapping of awareness, what we have is internal awareness. That's the distance is equal zero, right? Because it's immediate, it's internal to you. And that is feeling like. External awareness would have a distance greater than zero. And if it's the past, it will be sight-like. And if it's about the future, it will be vision-like. Without time, there would be no purpose for finance. Right? At the core of all financing is enabling a buyer to have the finances to buy something when they do not have the finances immediately available. These show up in leases, loans, and other financial instruments. This also requires the borrower to compensate the lender for the opportunity costs of holding on to their money. In many economies, this is calculated as interest paid over specific periods of time. Some Islamic economies do not permit the use of interest and calculate compensation to the lender in other ways. So at the core of this, right, is that a person borrows money now so as to decrease the time until experiencing what they have decided to. So, for example, experiences of owning a home, driving a car, wearing clothing and jewelry, traveling on vacation. The whole point of borrowing is so that you don't have to wait as long to save up to buy these things. So the borrower finds a benefit from buying now instead of waiting for finances to accumulate. This is associated with the concept of time preference. How much more one prefers an experience now than waiting is called time preference. So the greater the time preference, the more the desire for immediate gratification. So preferences are how we weight what is important. How much would you pay now for a dinner now? How much would you pay now for the same dinner 1 year from now? Right. The ratio of these, we'll call price 1 divided by price 0, tells us how much less you prefer waiting. If the ratio is less than 1, we call it discounting. Right? So the weight on a moment is often represented by W of T. So W for weight, T for time. Now, you could also be considering decreasing the distance to earning income. A person or a business might also borrow money to use as an investment to make more money. In this case, the desire is to experience more income or profit. The income earned relative to the amount invested is referred to as the return on investment, and it's measured in percent. Only when the ROI is greater than the interest rate would a profit maximizer borrow the money. The required difference between ROI and interest increases as the distaste for risk and uncertainty increases. All right, so the gap of compensation for this risk is called a risk premium. When risk premium is great, some business opportunities are avoided, even if they were expected to make some profit. So this is an important insight here. The more people are risk averse, the greater the gap between what they're willing to invest in and what could have been invested in profitably anyhow. This brings us to a very important financial tool, present value calculations. So present value is an attempt to express in a single number the value of investments that generate revenues and costs into the future. It is a way of estimating expected profit. The discount rate expresses how myopic or short-run focused the calculation is. The greater the discount rate, the more myopic the calculation. So what are some important factors? Well, one is the interest rate. So for example, if you had $1,000 and you held it for 10 years at 2%, it would be $1,219. So from a financial perspective, $1,219 in 10 years would have the same value as $1,000 now. So the greater the interest rate, the less finances in the future are worth now. Uncertainty, as we were talking about before. So the greater the uncertainty, the greater the premium necessary. Essentially, looking into the future is like looking into a fog. There is greater uncertainty the deeper into the future we consider, and thus an increasing premium is sought. An increased discount rate expresses this myopia. So the greater the risk aversion, uncertainty aversion, the more myopic the decision making will end up being. So what's the intuition behind this? Well, if you deposited a principal of X naught dollars today in an account that compounded at the rate of R per year, after 1 year you would have, well, X1 is the amount in 1 year, X0 is what you started with, so X0 times 1 plus R, that is what X1 would be. This also implies that X0, the value now, would be equal to X1 times 1 divided by 1 plus R. Now, if you deposit a principal of X naught dollars today in an account that compounded at the rate of R per year, after T years, you would have XT is equal to X naught times 1 plus R to the T, or X naught is equal to XT times 1 plus R to the minus T, right? Or XT times 1 divided by 1 plus R. And here's the general formula for present value. It takes into account the net income stream, the discount rate, and the time horizon. And the little t is the different time periods. Now, net income is revenues minus costs in a particular time period. All right, so let's consider an example of a calculation for those that haven't worked with this before. So imagine an investment A requires a layer of $10 million now and will provide a net income of $5 million a year for years 2 through 6. A second investment requires a $20 million layout now and will provide a net income of $10 million a year during years 3 through 6. So now we'll ask the question, at a discount rate of 10%, what is the present value of each? Well, the discount factor in year T will be 1 plus 0.10 because 10% is the same thing as 0.10. So 1 plus 0.10 to the minus T. And here's the table that has the amount that's being laid out now. So that's year 0. Year 1, nothing happens. And then years 2 through 6, that's 5 each year for A, and years 3 through 6, that's 10 for each of B. Once we go and do the calculations, and you can see at the bottom how it's expanded out, so in case you want to do it for yourself. And we see that investment A has a slightly higher present value than B. Now, this is important to recognize because if you did not take into account discounting, your first impression would have been, okay, well, investment A, we've got to lay out 10 million now, but then we'll have 5 years of 5 each. That's 25 minus 10. Well, that's 15. Whereas with B, it would have been 4 years at 10. So that's 40 minus 20. So that's 20. First impression might have been, oh, well, B is a better investment than A. That would be true if you did not discount at all. But if you are discounting, then you can get it to be turned around. So this is why the discount factor and the discount rate are a critical element of present value calculations. And unfortunately, it's also the most subjective. While it's typically related to the interest rate, even what the interest rate is can be highly subjective. Now, let's say we consider different discount rates. Now, how does this impact the decision making? Well, what we see is that if the discount rate was at 50%, a year from now is only worth half as much as today, and then a year after that is a quarter. So it's a very, very steep discounting. We would find that the present value for both investment A and investment B would be negative. So at a 50% discount rate, neither would be an acceptable investment. What about a 25% discount rate? Well, at 25%, investment A is slightly positive. It's not a lot, but it is positive. So that would be an acceptable investment. But investment B is still negative, and so that would be unacceptable. So which project? Well, it would be A instead of B. How about at 10%? Well, at 10%, that's what we already did. They're both acceptable, but A is still a little bit better than B. How about at 2.5%? Well, now they're both acceptable, but investment B has the higher present value. So in this case, we would start choosing B instead of A. And if the discount rate was 0.5% a year, then both are acceptable and B is still the better investment. So as you can see, the amount of the discount rate is associated with different decisions. Which do you choose, A or B, or neither? And that changes with the discount rate. Even if the amount that's laid out to begin with and the net income stream stays the same. So this is why understanding the discount rate and its implications, especially for long-run sustainability projects, is critical. Now, we can ask it a similar question, the same kind of numbers, but in a different way. So let's say we're considering an investment dealing with harvesting of natural resources. And the two alternatives now being considered is using a process such that $10 million more worth of wheat can be harvested now, although the greater soil depletion means having $5 million less worth of wheat in years 2 through 6. And B is another process that allow you to get $20 million more worth of wheat now, but the greater soil depletion means having $10 million less worth of wheat in years 3 through 6. So we're using the same numbers as we did before, except now we get the gain in year 0 and the losses in the future. So we're just multiplying all the net incomes and investments by a negative. And no surprise, what happens with the table? Well, we're multiplying everything by -1. If it's a 50% discount rate, you would choose B. If it's a 25% discount rate, you would still choose B. But once it gets to 10% or a lower discount rate, the present values would all be negative. So you would pick neither of these. Why is this again significant to sustainability? Because the notion of harvesting more wheat now is just the idea of being able to go through more natural resources today at the cost of having less in the future. obviously, this can also deal with degradation and pollution. Anything that's associated with trying to extract more now at the cost of having less in the future. The lower the discount rate, the less inclined we would be to extract for a short run gain. Now, present value calculations use an exponentially decaying weight. We'll call it delta for now. It is used since it assures self-consistency. Now, self-consistency describes a plan such that as long as it has been fulfilled, the decision maker would still find it optimal. In other words, if you've done everything so far according to the plan and it's worked out exactly, a self-consistent plan would still be optimal for the decision maker to continue with that plan. So a plan would not be self-consistent if you actually did what was planned, say for the first year or two, and then when you got to the third year, it would be, well, it doesn't make sense to stick with the plan anymore, even if nothing has changed. So an exponentially decaying weight will reach its halfway point at about 70 divided by delta years. So for those who are familiar, this is the rule of 70. And we can graphically represent this in terms of the relative importance, in other words, the discount factor, as time goes by based on different discount rates. So the red curve, the one that drops off most steeply, would be indicative of a 25% discount rate. This, based on research trying to estimate consumer discount rates, this would actually be the least myopic of estimates about consumer behavior. Very often, consumers have a much higher discount rate and tend to be much more myopic. But we'll use the 25% for now. So the half-life would be about 3 years. How about a 10%? Well, at 10%, the half-life is 7 years. And as a historical fact, back in the early 80s, under the Reagan administration, where they mandated cost-benefit analysis on potential federal programs, they needed to specify a discount rate. And at that time, because the interest rate was high, they said, do as many cost-benefit analysis with present value calculations using different discount rates as you want, but one of them has to be 10%. So in most cases, only one analysis was presented at the 10%. So 7 years half-life. Now, what does that mean, 7 years half-life? It means that half of the concern about the benefits going to the future focuses on the next 7 years, and that is as important as the rest of all time after that. 7 years is not a very long period of time if you're considering or concerned at all about what the impacts are going to be in 50 or 100 years. What about 2.5%? So this is in the ballpark of where Treasury bonds have been recently. It's been a little higher, a little lower. And that's associated with a 28-year half-life. So now at 2.5%, we're starting to consider generational effects, roughly a little over one generation. But to get a seventh generation perspective, so when we say seventh generation, it's referring to a supposed quote about indigenous population in America, where the principle was make decisions taking into account the impact on the seventh generation. Well, if a generation is about 20 years, then 7 times 20 is 140 years. In order to get that, you would have to use a discount rate of 0.5%. So keep this in mind, right? The average person is hard pressed to be less myopic than at a 25% discount rate. That is 50 times as fast a drop off as the one that's associated for a seventh generation view. Now, a term that we're going to use is regard for the future. So if we sum all the weights of how much consideration of the future the decision maker has, right? So all the discount factors going into the future. We can call this sum the regard for the future. So regard is thus the area under the curve, basically the sum of the weights, or if you've got continuous time, it's the area under the curve. Using exponential weights for the sake of self-consistency. Again, the idea here is the whole point of doing present value calculations, cost-benefit analysis, is with respect to making a long-term plan. And what is the point of making a long-term plan if it is not self-consistent? In this case, what W would be the exponential minus rho times t. With the graph, we did have a horizontal line at the top. That horizontal line indicates that there is no discounting. In other words, 10 years is just as important as today. 100 years from now is just as important. 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000 years. All of those are considered just as important as today. Well, if the weight is 1, then all the way across, and it's going off to infinity, then the regard would be infinite. So anytime we're dealing with decision making where we're going to take into account the impact going off to infinity years into the future, we are talking about having an infinite regard. When there is not a finite regard, we cease being able to use present value calculations and economic rationality. So this would be a transcendent perspective. In order to make decisions from a basis of infinite regard, you have to transcend the current moment and any kind of, even a little bit of myopia. Okay, and then again, the area under the curve is the regard. Now, if we were to completely discount the future, right, so this bottom red line, our regard would be 0. In other words, we're concerned about the here and the now, and we're not concerned at all about the future. We're discounting anything that's happening in the future. If it's not happening now, we don't care about it. Whether it's positive benefit or negative benefit, it's just ignoring it. So unlike infinite regard being a transcendent perspective, 0 regard is a momentary perspective. It's only concerned about the moment. And we could, again, graphically represent the amount of regard as a function of discount rate and time horizon. So time horizon is how many years into the future are you considering in the present value calculation. And what we see is from the upper left, that has the lightest gray, that represents the smallest amount of regard, right? Because it's a very short time horizon and it's steep discounting. So not much regard for the future at all. As we go to the lower right, the time horizon gets further out and the discounting is smaller, right? We have greater and greater regard. So for those that are interested in sustainability, low regard for the future is antithetical to a sustainability ethic. So again, discount rate of 0, that implies an infinite regard. This now gets tied into issues of spirit or spirituality and decision making, because this is a step toward transcendent decision making, where it's not focused on the present. It is as if the only thing that's concerned is everything other than the present. Now, this leads us to something we can call the myopic trap. So the myopic trap is a vicious cycle of increasing short-sightedness. So how does this work? Well, it occurs when one makes a choice that decreases expectations or increases uncertainty of future well-being. So preferences adapt by increasing the discount rate, in other words, caring less about the future. In the process, this leads to making more myopic choices, which cycles back into caring less about the future. To avoid the trap, you have to do something that will value and inspire the long view. So notice what's going on here. Our preferences are not static. Right? They adapt to what's going on. The foggier, the less appealing the future, the more we tend to want to ignore it. But as we ignore it, that changes our decision making, which then leads to looking for more benefits now and accepting greater costs into the future because we just don't care as much about the future. Now, let's consider present value and how it relates to punishment and behavior. Some economists will argue that in order to get better compliance, you sometimes need to increase punishment. So how does discount rate and myopia affect the benefit from having longer punishments? All right, so legal system uses jail time not only as a punishment, but also to discourage illegal behavior. So the question, does doubling jail time double the disincentive? Okay, so let's consider a present value calculation of this. If you have a large enough screen, you'll see a table. And what do we have? On the first column, you have months of punishment. So how many months into the future one would be in jail. So 1 month or 2 months, we go up to 24 months. And this is the monthly discount rate along the top. So 0.001 means that the discount rate is 0.1% per month. That's a fairly low discount rate. So that is associated with at least a reasonably long-term view of the world. As we go to the right, the discount rate gets larger and larger. All the way to the right, we have a 0.1 or 10% a month discount rate. That's a pretty steep discounting. So that person is coming from a pretty myopic perspective. So what are we doing here? Basically, for each month, it's not like you serve all 24 months in one moment. It's spread out over 24 months. Being in jail in month 24, well, its present value in terms of the disincentive toward behavior is going to be smaller based on how myopic the person is who's considering the crime. So what we have here then, associated with each month and discount rate, is the present value of that number of months punishment, taking into account the discounting. And what do we see? To the left, where we have a very, very small discount rate, 24 months would have the impact of about 23.7. So with someone with a very, very low discount rate, the threat of a 24-month punishment would have the equivalent of almost 24 times the disincentive of a 1-month punishment. But as we have the discount rate increase, take a look at what happens to the 24 months. It starts off being worth 23.7, then 23.2, then 22.6. And eventually, if you've got someone who's fairly myopic at that 10% a month discounting, 24 months would only have the impact of about a 9-month sentence. In other words, it's only 9 times the disincentive as a 1-month punishment. What is also important is how long is a prison sentence going to be before it just doesn't provide any more disincentive. So in the case of the most myopic to the left, yes, 24 is the same as 9, but notice 12 is about 7, right? 6.988, so we'll call it 7. So the idea here is, yes, a 12-month punishment doesn't have the impact of 12 times a 1, but it's still 7. But if we wanted to add another 12 months as part of the initial punishment, it would only provide about 2 months worth of punishment disincentive. So what this is saying is if you've got someone who's pretty myopic, anything much more than a 12-month sentence, it's not really buying you anything as far as a disincentive. But to follow through with it, that's another 12 months in jail. So the question is it worth spending that much to keep them in jail, committing oneself to keeping them in jail, when the disincentive gain is not much? So we have a kind of an irony here, where those who are very myopic, and we might believe that those who are more myopic are more likely to commit a crime, also means that they're the ones that a long prison sentence might not provide much more of a deterrence than a shorter one. On the other hand, for the individuals for whom a long prison sentence would be a major deterrent, they're probably already thinking about the future more and considering the consequences. And so mathematically, this is what we're talking about here. Regard is equal to the present value of a stream of 1 unit starting at period 1 and with infinite horizon. In other words, regard would be 1 year of life. That's your net benefit. If you continue into the future, you get another year of life. So regard is a temporal equivalent in terms of the number of years or number of persons. So there's a number of ways you can use this. Regard in these simple models would be 1 divided by r. So as r goes to infinity, in other words, very, very infinite discounting, regard goes to 0. But as r goes towards 0, in other words, no discounting at all, the regard goes off to infinity. Distance to the past and sum costs. So in standard economics, the past is understood as actions and choices that have already occurred and cannot be undone. The term sunk or historical cost refers to the economic costs that have already been incurred and cannot be changed. So the implication is that if we are optimizing for the future, we do not treat what has happened as part of the benefit cost analysis going forward. So if you ever hear the phrase some costs are sunk, this is what they're talking about. Right? You've already laid the money out. There's no point of using good to chase after the bad. However, people often make choices influenced by a desire to make their past choices come out well. So this shows up when people double down on a path that does not seem to have a positive outcome. So this is part of a decision maker wanting to protect a reputation or ego by continuing to act as if those decisions are the best way forward. We want to consider weighing the importance of the past. The past can be discounted as well. In econometrics, this is often done to weight recent data more than old data. The econometric method is referred to as a moving average. From the perspective of enduring experiences, a person that is sentimental or holds on to the past will have a lower past discount rate. A person that easily lets the past go will have a high past discount rate. We can now represent preferences over time, not only in terms of the weighting into the future, but also the weighting into the past. And then how is the present, the now, the immediate now, weighted against both the future and the past. In terms of enjoying the moment now, that will be associated with a different set of focuses and weightings on the experiences of the past and our imaginings about the future and what's going on now. And if that is used to express behavior and decision making, if we're going to consider the costs of the past and how we weight the past, we have an important topic to consider, and that is carry cost. This is the cost associated with owning a resource. There is a cost to keeping the past nearby. So what are the benefits and costs of carrying the past? What are the benefits and costs of carrying a decision? You've made a decision maybe a year or two ago. Are you still holding on to that decision? So this relates to distance and frequency of deciding and choosing. So some questions. What happens when we influence our experiences of deciding and choosing? What are the costs and benefits of changing when they occur? Do these affect how we decide and choose? How does the distance to deciding and choosing affect what we experience now? Now, as a little bit of an addenda, I'd like to talk about duration, wavelength, and frequency, because these are concepts that are essential for understanding where we're going, especially with economics of mind. Another way to understand time is as the duration before an event is repeated. So, for example, how long between sunrises, right? The length of a day. If an event occurs repeatedly, in other words, oscillates over a short time, it has a frequency. So, for example, sound is a type of vibration. If you look closely at a speaker in slow motion, you will see it oscillates back and forth. So the number of times it oscillates in a second is the frequency of the sound. This is measured in hertz, Hz, although it's sometimes referred to as cycles per second. So bass notes have low frequencies and treble notes have high frequencies. And for the most part, the human range for audible sound is between 20 and 20,000 hertz, typically a wider range when you're younger, a narrower range as you get older. The amplitude is how high the wave goes up. The greater the peak of the wave, the louder it would be. A deeper pitch has a low frequency, so that means it has a long wavelength, whereas a higher pitch has a shorter wavelength. Hence, the deeper pitch, you don't see as many cycles in a second, graphs, as compared to the higher pitch. So since sound moves through the air at about 1,100 feet per second, a note at 110 hertz, so 110 hertz is the A 2 octaves below a middle A, would have a wavelength of about 10 feet. A note at 550 hertz, that's roughly the C sharp above middle C, would have a wavelength of about 2 feet. Just as a reminder that when we talk about wavelength, this actually shows up in how we perceive sound. Now, we can also imagine wavelength as the time between repeating events. So, for example, the time between deciding what to eat would be related to the frequency with which one eats. If the wavelength is the distance between events, then frequency is the number of repetitions within a fixed duration. So the more frequent an event, the shorter the time before repeating. So very frequent choices: breathing, moving our body. In terms of economic actions, for example, buying non-durable goods. That's a little bit more of a long-term decision making, right? If you're considering buying a refrigerator, right? That's a more long-term decision than deciding what boxes of cereal to buy right now. So how does discount rate and wavelength relate? Well, the discount rate is associated with a length of time when weighting goes down by 1/2. So this is repeated over and over, and that is the nature of exponential decay. So low discount rates have long wavelengths, and high discount rates have short wavelengths. So using the analogy of sound, it is as if listening to the deep past or the distant future requires hearing the deepest notes, right? So low frequencies have long wavelengths. Listening to the present, the now, requires focusing on the shortest wavelengths. So the implication of all this, if the discount rate is associated with a wavelength and a frequency, the discount rate is essentially the frequency that financially we're tuning into. If you were to imagine a spectrum of financial voices speaking from the future, the discount rate is associated with tuning in to one particular voice. So, we're talking about listening to central banks. How you listen to it depends on what your discount rate is and how far in the future you're considering. Okay, so that ends this presentation, and the next one will be time as a constraint on decision making.